recording the lecture now. All right, so evening. So tonight we're dealing with environmental assessment, an incredibly important tool when it comes to that control toolbox in the command control scenario. And we're going to deal with what I've called endangered spaces and species. So there'll be actually 2 PowerPoints that we're going to go through. Both of those, as you would know, are on Moodle. All right, as usual, I've also posted some video online for you to take a look at. I put them up yesterday. They're two, I put them up there beside each other because they really do argue separate points with respect to how to best preserve the environment going forward, most predominantly with respect to resources, you know, whether they're renewable or not. So the 2 YouTube videos I put up and there were TED Talks, which are usually quite informative. One was called Solar versus Coal, and the other one was why renewables can't save the planet. So I'm going to start off. Can somebody give me an overview or a hypothesis of what the first video, Solar versus Coal, what that speaker had to say? Anyone want to give take a shot at that?
I can talk a little bit on it, just
All right.
from what I remember.
Sure.
What I gather from that is basically highlighting the ongoing shift, or how far we have come, on our dependency on coal fuel versus solar, and where we are today, and how technology has advanced in that. But he also talked primarily as to where the economic benefit is going, or the economic investment is. And from that, I get where maybe he's trying to enlighten us as to where the true investment are being made now. He referred to the job count as to what was promised from the coal industry versus what was delivered, and sort of compare that with what the emerging solar energy industry is generating as towards job. So my takeaway from that, Mel, him as a businessman and an investor, he will start touting the success of the solar energy and deeming that as the way forward.
Okay. Does anybody have anything to add to that? I have a couple of questions on it, but anything else from anybody?
Yes, sir. I have some things to say about
Michelle.
that.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, my glasses got stuck in my microphone.
I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Anyway,
I still can't hear you. Check your microphone. Okay, try again.
Can you hear me now?
That's a little better. Okay.
Okay, sorry. You know, where I live out here, I can see the solar panels or the windmill farms, and in the wintertime, we have these little bobcats that come. In the first season that they came, there was a mom and her 2 babies. There was a female and a male, and the female was about, I don't know, she must have been 2 years old. She was a little bigger than the little guy. The little guy must have been a couple of months old, and his bones were sticking out of him, and one eye was going off in a different direction than the other one, like he was getting cross-eyed, and because he was malnutrition, or how do you say that?
What kind of, who are these?
The bobcats.
Oh, bobcats. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Anyway, so yeah, and you know, I just felt really bad for them, so I fed them. I know we're not supposed to, but I feel really bad. I'm looking at these windmill farms, and we took away their land, and we took away their homes, and where their food is, and their shelters. So I feed them, and I don't really care what people say. I think that it's saving life, because I think that we're taking away a lot from them, and I just can't understand. You know, like, we have a lot of other means to produce energy that's more efficient, you know, and I just don't understand why, no offense to people, but why don't we go back to the horse and buggy days and just get rid of cars? I mean, our great-grandparents did it. Why can't we just go back prior to pre-industrial ways and times and live like that?
Well, that's kind of the argument that was being made in the second YouTube video, the one that was why renewables won't save the planet, but it went totally the other direction, as in why we should rely on nuclear power, which basically segues into our last class on a question that somebody raised with respect to why do we still have nuclear. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I understand what you're saying. So Michelle, what you're basically saying is, you know, why don't we just get rid of all of the kind of things that that potentially cause damage to the environment.
Well, I mean, not necessarily all kinds of things. Like cars cost a lot to the environment. Look at the damage that they've done. And so do windmill farms. And we're not getting anything from the windmill farms, according to what the video said. So, you know, why don't we just, you know, do what we're doing now and stay home and save the environment? I mean, we haven't seen the results yet of any tests that have you know, with us staying home due to COVID, what that's done on the environment yet. So we might be astounded what it's done.
Oh, I think we've seen, if you see pictures of Beijing and Moscow, I mean, the smog has lifted off of those cities. That's you in most circumstances before COVID-19, you couldn't see the environment at all. They couldn't see the skies at all. So the lack of activity, industrial activity, is a function of people not being able to go into factories and work. Has really been a benefit, but it's a very short-term benefit, obviously, because once everybody gets back to the industry and the production of you know, effluents and smoke and what have you, then the smog will return. But you know, it's a good point. But before we talk some more about what you're doing, Michelle, I still want to go back to the first video with respect to solar versus coal. What was, so, and Orette, maybe you want to address this, but I mean, what was his hypothesis? Did he believe that there was a war on coal? Anybody want to, Lexine? Lexine?
Oh, yes, sir.
Did you want to answer the question, or did you just pop up?
I think it was no. I don't think he believed that there was a war.
Yeah, you're right. He thought that there wasn't a war on coal, but what was the premise of that position?
If I don't remember. Sorry.
Okay.
Sir, I would like to.
Sure.
Yes.
Shivani, go ahead.
So basically, for me, I think that he doesn't really believe that there's a war on coal, but he believed that reason why the solar industry is becoming more popular is that people are more aware of climate change and environmental issues. So like they are more eager to implement like solars or go for that department than, you know, using coal, because, you know, coal is very, you know, it's non-renewable and it poses a threat on the environment. So like solar, no, it's more natural, renewable. So I think that is why people are more going for it. And using solar too, it reduces like your electricity bill. So it's kind of cheaper in a sense. Maybe it's expensive to acquire, but it's cheaper eventually.
Yeah, the way he described it, thank you. The way he described it was like it was an evolutionary kind of thing. I mean, he started off talking about, you know, how, you know, we did go from, you know, basically horses to horse and buggies, then to cars, and, you know, obviously then more advanced modes of transportation, and it was just an evolution, or how we went from slide rules, which I'm sure none of you have used, but I have, slide rules, to things as simple as calculators, but, you know, which, you know, they do them, you do the calculations extremely fast, and it's certainly more sophisticated than what a slide rule is. And how everything basically, you know, is replaced by something that is better. You know, at least that's the premise of his argument. Better in that it operates better. It's certainly more powerful, as in all your iPhones. And I'm like him. When I went to high school, we had an entire half of the basement of the high school was a computer room. It was hermetically sealed. You couldn't get into it unless, you know, basically you were allowed into it. You know, and it was like nobody could be in there. No more than one or two people could be in there. You had to make sure that your clothes were clean. And you know, what you hold in your hand now is probably 10 times more powerful than that entire room was. So you know, these things have evolved, and I think what his argument is that, you know, the fact that coal, you know, has existed as a very plentiful source of fuel over the course of the last probably century and a half will, as a function of the evolution of these kind of things, disappear and be replaced by, and his argument was, you know, basically renewable energy, solar and wind. All right, and so that was his argument. Does anybody want to add to that?
Sir, yes.
Sure.
Yes, sir. Because I remember when he said like technology is becoming more advanced. So like back then we used to use like typewriters and so forth. Now we're using like laptops and those type of stuff. So yeah, basically he also said that people are basically moving from solar because, you know, things are more modernized then in a sense. So like what you would use in the contemporary days is not what you use now.
Right. Before we move on to the next video, what he was really referring to, and you probably most of you know this, is the war on coal is a war that has been is ostensibly been declared by those people in the coal sector who actually mine coal and rely upon coal for the purposes of their living. You know, they argue that in fact, if you basically close down the coal mines, which is the plan that most Western democracies have, you're going to deprive people of their jobs and what have you. And what he was basically saying is that that's just not going to happen. You'll get more jobs with renewable energy. Solar power generates more jobs now in the United States than does coal. That in fact it will just disappear. Just so you know, last year, the year before, President Trump made an announcement that in fact he was taking the moratorium off of coal mining in the U.S. He was allowing new coal mines to be developed, and he referred to them as clean coal, right? And you know, clean coal being somehow or other taking away the fundamental nature of coal, which is a very dirty mineral. So anyway, that's looked at as one of his more stupid statements. But having said that, he does certainly support that because his political base is in the American South, Arkansas and what have you, and Kentucky, states that very much have a big coal industry in them. That's the war on coal. Basically, it's a war being tried to be fought by those who actually make a living at it. But you know, it will disappear. And the Liberal government in Canada has now rededicated itself to basically taking the reliance of coal generation out of our resource grid. Aret, you had something else to say?
Yeah, I was going to add to the war on coal and my thoughts on it. You said most of that too. Whereas I think there is a war on coal, and there are environmental activists who is saying let's shut it down, and there are proponents for it, persons who mine it and survive based on, because there are still areas in the States that depend heavily on coal mining industry, right? So they're feeling the crunch of it's dying out. So there's a war on it. But the speaker, that wasn't his main thing though, like he's for or against. It was just touting again the benefits of solar and where we're going, the evolution that has taken place, is natural evolution as relates to technological advancement and where we were from the telephone, the train and automobiles come from buggies and all that, and where we're going. So I didn't get the feeling that he himself was picking against coal. It was just stating the fact that's out there and outlining the evolutionary track.
Yeah, I think he was trying to make it as objective as he could. So that's good. Georgia?
Yeah, I had a question about, it's kind of about both videos, and with regards to the safety of like workers for both coal and solar or wind energy, because the second guy was kind of saying that there's lots of accidents that happen when solar and wind farms, which I didn't know happened. Like I thought coal was definitely the more dangerous one, because I don't know, coal mining just has always been considered really dangerous. And I was just wondering if, yeah, like what's the difference if there's such a big difference still, or if it's coal mining's gotten safer, and if solar and wind mining is just as dangerous, like he made it seem kind of in the second video.
When coal mines were the predominant source of energy in the United States, this is the end of the 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s to the 1920s and 30s, it was an incredibly dangerous business. Matter of fact, it was the most dangerous industry in the Western world. More people were being killed and hurt in coal mines than any other business. The most common injury were caused by working on railways, right, which is now pretty much gone by the wayside. But anyway, and all of those things, that total amount of damage and injury to people are what gave rise to, believe it or not, universal applications of workers' compensation legislation in the 1920s and 30s, because so many people were being injured. I have to think that they're obviously a lot safer nowadays. I mean, they, whatever it takes in order to ensure that people, are safe, going underground, which obviously is what the mining is all about. I presume that those kind of safety things are taken care of. Everybody would have health and safety committees. They'd all be unionized now, so the union would be responsible to make sure that their workers are safe. And I would still think, however, no matter how safe they are, it is on its face a pretty dangerous occupation. Going down deeply into the Earth's core. So we did see a picture of a fire on top of a windmill, basically, and a wind turbine. I have to think that, and he didn't really, well, he put that picture up. This is in the second video. Clear, and both, one guy fell from the turbine and the other one was engulfed in the flames. So, 2 people died. I haven't really heard a lot or seen many statistics that say that, it has to be the construction and or the maintenance of either wind farms or solar farms have caused a lot of injury, not personal injury anyway. But that, but the argument he made with respect to the environmental injuries they cause was pretty powerful, basically on the premise that, wind farms and solar farms take up a monumental amount of landmass to be constructed, which obviously destroys all of the ecosystems that were on that land before they were built. So I still think, to answer your question, I still think that coal mines are probably more dangerous. There's probably more injury in them than there is in the construction or maintenance of renewable resources. I'm just guessing, but I think that's a pretty educated guess. Alyssa? Alyssa, did you want to say something? Ariana? Okay, I have names up. Shivani? Again, yes?
Oh, sorry, that was from a long time. Sorry.
Oh, was it? Okay, you already called on you, so good enough. All right. So again, Alyssa or Ariana, nothing? That's fine. Anybody else on either one of those videos? I was just going to say about the second one. I was struck by the when I first watched it to show it to you guys. I was struck by his introduction to himself as being pretty much an environmentalist, especially in California, which is very environmentally cognizant kind of jurisdiction. So the fact that he came from that kind of background, the fact that he had worked in the environmental kind of milieu for protecting the environment, and that he's now so dedicated towards the proliferation of nuclear energy and the things that and how safe it may be. That struck me as really something that I really hadn't seen much of in the past. It's not often that you see somebody argue against renewable resources in favor of nuclear power, and all the things we talked about in last class with respect to the danger of nuclear power, the difficulty of getting rid of the waste, the thousands, hundreds of thousands of years for half-life of waste material, all those kind of things. Valerie, you had your hand up?
Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry, my dishwasher running.
Okay.
But I was kind of questioning all those windmills that went up in southern Ontario, all of the land that they bought up, all of the farms that have the noise of the windmills, and we still aren't getting that much energy from them based on this. Are they just kind of like a waste of space, time, money, what have you? Or is it going to actually be utilized more in the future and they're just trying to find a way to do it?
Wind is a viable source of renewable energy. The trick has always been that, and it was alluded to in the video. The trick has always been that it's not always windy when you need the energy, right? The sun doesn't always shine when you need the energy. And so the trick isn't necessarily the use of wind turbines itself. It's the storage of the energy that they create. And that's totally down to the efficiency of the battery power that they put in place, right? And that's getting better and better. And even though batteries today, as sophisticated as they've become, are exactly the same kind of batteries that you put in flashlights in the 1930s. The technology for batteries hasn't changed that much, although Elon Musk is looking at developing some pretty advanced batteries for homes and what have you. But the core, the cadmium and all those kind of things that are in batteries pretty much hasn't changed over time. But as a source of renewable energy, it's workable. It's workable, and it is obviously renewable, which is important. And the price is coming down, just like the price of solar is coming down. Although from some of the charts that the fellow in the second video said or put up there, it certainly doesn't compare to the total cheapness of nuclear power. Shivani, you had your hand up again?
Yes.
Sure.
So on that video, I was struck by the fact that the windmill were killing like the birds, I think the video said that. So like hearing about windmill all your life, like you wouldn't even think of that. So I was very surprised by that.
Yeah, me too. But I knew that. I mean, it kills, and the point of it was that it kills large endangered species. It kills eagles and hawks. It's not like he was talking about bird or cats on the ground that kill sparrows and jays and what have you, which aren't endangered. So it does damage to large animals, and this goes back to what Michelle was saying, at the beginning, that there are. And she lives up in Goulet, so she sees the wind farm there, I presume, every time she drives to school. So it's and the sound, and I'm not sure if it was George who said that, but the sound is something that people truly complain about. They it's in the background. If you live close enough to it, it's something that is always there. It's kind of like white noise. And people complain that not only do they hear it and it bothers them, but it causes headaches, or it causes other kinds of illness that they never had before these things were put in place. So who knows? I mean, it's still a relatively new technology. So all of the potential damage that may well be caused by these kind of things has to be taken into account. And again, the vast amounts of land mass that have to be taken to create enough space to put up enough wind turbines or enough solar panels to make it economically efficient to build them in the first place. Once those lands are dedicated for those purposes, they're never going back, to any other use. So, those were interesting points that the guy made in comparison to, the much smaller land mass required for nuclear power plants. And the other thing that he said that was quite interesting was that when, and this is in the US, when certain states, when they were put to referendums with respect to whether nuclear power plants should be shut down or upgraded and expanded, it was the second choice, upgrading and expanding them, that seemed to be what the population agreed to. I presume after certainly having public presentations by the proponents and opponents of nuclear energy. I just think so. Anything else, guys, about either one of those videos? Again, I put those two conflicting videos up to foster some conversation. Anybody have anything else to say? Shivani, your hand's still up. Did you still want to say something else?
Oh no, I'm sorry.
That's okay, no problem. Pete, you just came up.
I wanted to say the nuclear power. He was expressing that it was had a smaller environmental impact overall.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody around Chernobyl would agree with that, but
No.
but yeah, absolutely, that was his argument, that it was certainly a smaller footprint, and the amount of energy basically generated as a function of that was enormous compared to the the resources required to build renewable energy.
I wanted to say too that the windmills, I think they put a stress impact on people. You know, like it's like a stress that's put on them, and they don't realize it's on themselves.
Yeah, and again, that's part of the argument. People, who live close to them, and obviously they're put up after they've already lived somewhere, so it's they don't move there intentionally. It's put up afterwards. Yeah, a lot of people complain about the effect of that motion and the noise and the changing in the wind velocities and all those kind of things. So yeah, and again, it's pretty early, so I don't think there are a lot of properly conducted experiments that give us conclusions in that regard, but we'll get there.
I've been seeing that they seem you shouldn't live any closer than I think they're allowing like 1,000 feet from a wind turbine, but right. I'm thinking 2,000 is probably better.
Well, and importantly, right, and this goes into our next lecture, into the lecture tonight. That kind of thing, how close you live to this kind of facility, is a function of an environmental assessment. That's what environmental assessments are all about. So anyway, any other questions, guys, or are we ready for the lecture? All right, good. Listen, thanks again for the participation. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let's go to environmental assessments, basically. So again, environmental assessments are incredibly important, right? They are, probably the most important tool in the toolbox to make sure that whatever rules and regulations are put in place to protect the environment are in fact adhered to as a function of an assessment. So here's what the Supreme Court of Canada has said. This is a quote: environmental assessment is a planning tool that is now generally regarded as an integral component of sound decision-making, right? And that's a very common sense kind of statement to make, but it's absolutely true, right? And so the basic premise is that certain activities that have possible environmental consequences should be scrutinized in advance. So again, and we've mentioned this in 2 or 3 other lectures, this is a function of the precautionary principle, right? That even though we don't necessarily know exactly what the science will tell us with respect to what something being advanced to take place, to be built, or to be marketed for, pesticides or herbicides or, resource extraction, any number of those things that have environmental impacts, the precautionary principle basically says that if there is a prospect of it causing environmental harm down the road, that the consequences of that should be taken into account in advance, right? So that applies in all kinds of situations. So what we have in an environmental assessment program, what we have is they have to deal with a number of things. So we want to know, so what activities does the assessment process apply to, right? Does it apply to somebody who applies to build something, right, that may well have an effect on the environment? It may have, for instance, it may be something that has an effluent that flows from it. So should that be something that is subject to an environmental assessment to see if that effluent is properly filtered and or discharged, right? Particularly if it's being discharged into a large body of water, that kind of thing. Should it apply, should we decide it applies to a certain size of project? Do we care if very small projects might have a little bit of an impact? Do we care about that? Or are we more concerned about larger projects that we know may well have, a much larger footprint when it's underway? So that's part of the decision making into whether an assessment is required. Does it apply to private or public operations? So should it only apply to projects, for instance, on indigenous territorial lands where there is the duty to consult and accommodate, right? That's a federal responsibility. We know that already. So should it only apply in that case, which to a great degree is a public project, but giving permission for a private resource extractor? Or should we concentrate on just strictly private operations that don't deal with the public as a whole? So, again, these are questions as to whether assessments are appropriate. Do we apply it to projects only, as in ones that are ready to put a shovel in the ground? applying for permits and licenses right off the hop? Or should we apply it to policies that are being generated, right, that have certainly an impact going forward? So those are the kind of things that we have to think about. Who should carry out the assessments? Should it be done by or at the cost of the person who's proposing to do something? Should it be done by professional consultants who are paid to come up with a result, right? And so the question becomes, is it a biased result if the proponent is paying for it? Or should it be a totally independent body, something that is, for instance, government paid and run at cost of the taxpayer, but is totally neutral and therefore not influenced by professionals who are being paid to do something? So that's important. What is the standard and scope of assessments? Should it also, in addition to environmental factors, take into account the social, cultural, and economic costs of a project? All right, so that's important to consider. Are we dealing primarily with concerns that are technical? And technical being, you know, how much of this particular compound or chemical is safe in this particular amount to go into an effluent, to go into a body of water? Should we, should we be dealing with that? Or should we be considering, beyond the technical aspects of something being proposed, how important is the activity that's being proposed? Arette, you raised your hand?
Yeah.
Sure.
The previous questions you asked was who pays for the assessment, right? The company, government, or taxpayers. And then I know there's some effect, right? Depending on who is paying. Currently, say the mining industry were doing their environmental assessment prior to a mine being open. Do you know who's paying? If it goes.
Yeah, it's actually the answer to that is a hybrid. Is almost in every case the proponent of a particular project. So, for instance, in the Ring of Fire, Noront Resources, a very large mineral extractor, they pay for these assessments, but you usually have energy regulators. So, for instance, again in Alberta, you have the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is a totally independent body funded by the government, i.e., the taxpayer. They are the ones that review the materials, paid for by the proponent for the purposes of getting approvals, right? So it's a combination. The fundamental cost of these most assessments is paid by the person who is looking to get a permit or a license to do something, that is certainly the bulk of the cost. But there is a public cost, again paid by the taxpayers, for a body, a tribunal, a board, or a commission for somebody to actually review the results that the proponent is paid for.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so the other questions are, once an environmental assessment is done, is the report that's generated, is it going to be subject to further review again by a government body? All right, you got to remember that we have the environmental assessment protocols in place for Canada, in the federal sphere, but each province and territory has also its own environmental assessment programs. So, they're not all the same. So these are questions, that may vary between jurisdictions. So, is there going to be a review of the work that's done again by the government? Is the public going to have input into what has been produced by the proponent for the assessment? Or is it going to be, like I said earlier, looked at by an administrative tribunal, the National Energy Board, the Impact Assessment Board, the Alberta Energy Regulator? Is that, so it totally depends upon how the environmental assessment regime is put in place. And should the reviews be mandatory or discretionary? Again, that's something that is put into place in whatever legislation is enacted for that purpose. Okay, so likewise, what are the consequences of not obtaining an approved environmental assessment? Does that mean that whatever was being proposed that required the assessment in the first place, does that mean that the project is dead, as in it fails? Or does it mean that the proponent simply has to go back and rework it so that it can be approved or put up for approval again? Right? So again, that's a function of how the assessment is structured, basically. And importantly, what follow-up measures do we have that are available with respect to assessments. So for instance, the proponent has proposed an assessment, some administrative tribunal or regulator has approved it, right? And so the whatever was being proposed has been built, right? So what is put in place to monitor to ensure that whatever was, put in place as a safeguard at the front end of the project is also, functionally operational once that project is underway, right? Incredibly important to know that, because, it's much more, it's as important, to make sure that the environment is protected after a project is going as it is to make sure that it meets the environmental standards before it's given approval to commence. All right, so let's talk about federal environment assessment, the legislation and policies that have developed over time. So, this is not, again, this is in 1973 was when the federal government of Canada, again, Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party put this in place, which is probably without a doubt the most enlightened period of political governance that Canada has probably ever seen. But anyway, that's a long story, but it is. Trudeau did an amazing number of things, including obviously patriating the Constitution and enacting the Charter. He did a number of things that were very enlightened and very forward-looking. Some things not so much, but a lot of things he did. So in 1973, basically, the government adopted his cabinet. We all know, we talked about how the cabinet functions. They basically said that they want to put into place a program for a discretionary, all right? So again, remember, this is the very first time that's being proposed, a discretionary system of review, of environmental assessment reviews. Discretionary, of course, because now you're basically looking at imposing a system, across the country that didn't exist before. So you kind of have to work your way into it. It would have been very hard to put something in place that was absolutely mandatory that didn't exist before. So discretionary was the way to first go at it. And it took 20 years of that discretionary system in place in pretty much an ad hoc kind of way it was applied to end up eventually with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 1995. So 22 years after Trudeau's cabinet first proposed it. But this, of course, this legislation, did have mandatory provisions. So all that discretion, to a great degree, went by the wayside. All right, so the CEAA was intended to ensure that the environmental effects of projects were considered before the federal government took action to promote sustainable development. All right, so this was something that was put into place at the front end of any projects that dealt with, basically anything that had a responsibility for the federal government. So remember, again, we have to keep in mind that, provinces and territories have separate programs for projects that fall within provincial or territorial jurisdiction. So in Canada, right, it would, basically the CEAA, applied to crown lands that were owned by the federal crown, that applied to projects on lands, treaty lands, that were being administered by the federal government pursuant to the Constitution, federal responsibility. The Arctic, clearly, because that's a federal responsibility. We talked about that last day. And or anything by a corporation that had a federal charter. So those are the kind of things that were involved and caught by the CEAA. In order for it to apply to a project, it had to be established the project was within the terms of the legislation, which is pretty much what I just told you about, basically. Two fundamental types of projects under this legislation. The first were undertakings with respect to physical works, the actual construction of whatever was being proposed, which included, again, construction, operation, modification, decommissioning, abandon, or any other undertakings in relation to physical work. The construction of, for instance, of a factory, right? That's a really good example. I mean, any factories do, whatever they may produce, all have different kinds of concerns with respect to how they apply to the environment, both with respect to the construction of the factory and what it produces and how it gets rid of its waste as a function of that production, right? And the second involved activities unrelated to physical work, but were included in what was termed as the inclusion list. So these are things that weren't necessarily physical. So what this is, and this is very much like, you know, what we talked about last day when we talked about regulations dealing with sectors, right, as opposed to media, which is land, air, and water. So this is the same kind of thing. So the inclusion list for the CEAA basically addressed projects that related to natural parks, oil and gas projects, nuclear facilities, defense projects. You see that here: waste management, fisheries, wildlife, the north, again, forests, and projects on indigenous lands. So those were the included list. So that pretty much is a pretty comprehensive way to address environmental concerns for things that fall within federal jurisdiction, right? There were 4 possible procedures applicable to projects, right? So these are how the assessment process works. So the 4 are what were called screenings. So these kind of go from the least intensive to the most intensive: comprehensive study assessments, panel reviews, and mediation, right? So screenings and comprehensive study assessments were in the form of self-assessments, right? So they're actually done by the proponents of either physical construction or any of those items on the inclusive list, right? So they're done internally and then obviously turned over to the review body under the CEAA. Concerns certainly rose about the scope of the environmental process required under the Act as a function of, this is back in 1995, as a function of those self-assessments, because the question was rising, is that can we trust the proponents of these projects to provide a full and comprehensive assessment on themselves, right? That was the question that was raised, right? The responsible authority, again, under the Act, determines the scope of the project and the environmental assessment to be conducted. So that's once the mode of assessment is determined. A generous approach, again, this is how these are the options that are available. A generous approach to a project scope would lead to a broad, encompassing environmental assessment, right? So that is, basically, if a broad approach is taken, then there's going to be a really good look at all of the relative things that relate to the environment in the assessment process, right? So that's, and you would think that would be a good thing for the most part, and it is. A narrow approach just simply confines the ambit of the environmental assessment to very specific points. So for instance, in the construction of a factory, is there going to be waste during that construction that is going to be taken to a landfill site? That's an environmental concern. And how's that going to be transported to the site? Is it going to have long-term effect on the capacity of the site? All those kind of questions. That's kind of a narrow approach. Whereas a broad approach would be, yes, waste is generated during the construction, waste is generated during the operation, right? And how holistically we look at protecting the environment, before and after the construction. So that's a broader approach. Where the project was related to physical work, the assessments are conducted with respect to the activity of that work. Okay, so if a factory is being built for a very specific purpose, then that purpose, the utility of that factory is looked at as to what impact it has on the environment, basically. The question becomes, would the assessment extend to impacts outside the scope of the project? Would the question therefore becomes, would the assessment of what the factory actually does, right? If there's long-term impacts that may well, exist, should they be looked at? So let's go back to the example I gave you in the last class with respect to uranium mining in Bancroft, Ontario, right? So, the creation of a uranium mine, right? At the time that they were created, we'll just say that the CEAA was in place for that, and this is something that would fall under the CEAA. Right, so the application for a permit to build that mine would certainly take into account what was required to actually construct it, right? To dig into the ground, to ensure that it was safe with respect to those who are going to work underground and do the mining itself. But what about the long-term impacts? What about exactly? And I talked about last day. What about the prospect that there's going to be radioactive radiation emanating from the mine for God knows how far, for how long, right? So that's something that these kind of assessments may or may not take into account. Having said all of that, you know, in 2012, the CEAA was replaced with a new environmental assessment regime. So I'm going to give you, we're going to watch a very short video. It's a promotion by the CEAA with respect to the regime.
Major projects are developed in communities all across Canada. At the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, we work to make sure they are safe and sustainable. Before a project is built, an environmental assessment examines its potential effects on the environment and works to reduce or eliminate them. Your participation is key. At many stages of the process, Canadians, including Indigenous peoples, are invited to share their views. Throughout the process, we gather information and scientific evidence, including Indigenous traditional knowledge. Many factors are looked at, including effects on fish and fish habitat, marine mammals, Indigenous use of lands, and air quality, to name a few. A report is then produced with the science behind what was examined and ways to minimize impacts on the environment. It also includes public and Indigenous input received. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change decides whether a project may proceed. If it does, enforcement officers monitor the project to make sure the conditions are being met so the environment is being protected. That's environmental assessment in a nutshell.
Okay. So moving forward, so now, you know, I've given you this, you know, the last little while was pretty much an overview of what would potentially go into an environmental assessment. But now, as of 2012, you know, all of the things that started in 1973 have pretty much come full circle. So everybody pretty much understands what's going to be involved in environmental assessment, and it's going to be involved. It's going to be a broad approach taken. And it's going to be not only the physical construction and the physical outputs, but the outputs generally that may occur over the course of time, right? And over the course of distance. So projects that now are subject to federal assessment basically are going to be identified through what's called an initial regulatory listing, right? Which means they're actually published online that these projects are being proposed. And then there will be a determination by the agency as to the requirement of an assessment based upon the criteria that the regulatory listing sets out, right? So what happens is that the requirement of assessment is determined after there's an initial review of the project. So and this makes this clear, not everything that is built, you know, anywhere in Canada is going to be subject to an assessment, an environmental assessment. Not everything, most factories will be, but not every piece of construction is going to have an assessment undertaken. It is a bit of a review process. So there's the initial review that basically the CEAA looks at with respect to what the proponent is saying they are going to do, right? And then after the initial review, basically there will be input from the public sought, and we just saw that in that little video clip. So this is come to be something that is now a regular part of the process that was very discretionary up until a few years ago. And obviously there's going to be consideration of the potential adverse environmental effects that comes to light as a function of this initial review. Those potential adverse effects take into account impacts upon fish, birds, social, economic, health, and cultural consequences for Indigenous peoples, right? And you saw that bit of that in the clip. And importantly, there's no longer a provision for self-assessment by way of screening and comprehensive studies. So those things that were put in place in the 1995 legislation have been updated and basically removed, in that, you know, nobody relies upon proponents of projects to self-assess their environmental impact, right? And that's a good thing. All federal assessments are conducted by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, the National Energy Board, or the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. All right, so those are very broadly what we have, although now the CEAA is replaced by the Impact Advisory Board, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. All right, but those are the main bodies, the main regulatory bodies that do federal environmental assessments in Canada. Right, opportunities for public participation must be provided. We've already talked about that. The ultimate decision under the legislation with those boards is whether, after taking into account any mitigation measures that are going to be proposed by the proponent, will there still be significant adverse environmental effects. Okay, so again, while self-assessment is gone by the wayside, the proponents of projects still have to put their best foot forward with respect to how they see their project affecting the environment. And if there is going to be some effect, they have to obviously put forward mitigation measures to reduce the impact of that effect. If the conclusion is that adverse effects are likely, the matter will be referred to the cabinet to determine whether those effects are justified. All right, so it isn't a zero environmental impact regime. Right? That's just not the way it works. Right? Everybody.
Sir, can you hear me? We can't hear you. I can't hear anything you're saying.
I got a message a little while ago saying that I'm muted.
Can you hear me, Pete?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, good. You can't hear Miles either?
No, no, I don't hear him, no.
I can't hear him at all, sir. We can't hear you at all.
Okay,
Oh, I see a whole bunch of people don't hear him either, I think.
No, nobody.
Chat, eh?
Oh, no.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Now, yeah, okay. Sorry, guys. It's technology. What can I do? All right.
Why should we tell you?
I'm glad. No, that's great. How far back did we go?
I think it was a few slides.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. I'll just go back very quickly to.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry about that, guys. That's the first time that's happened, and we've had 5 or 6 classes. So far so good, I guess.
So we heard all of that.
Oh, did you? So the 20.
Yeah.
All right, and you got the elements in the new act.
Right here, yes, sir.
You got that? Okay.
No, right here, right here.
Right here. Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. So I talked about the how the 2019 Environmental Impact Assessment Act was updated. All right. So we're good. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to the federal regime, there are provincial environmental assessments put in place. The Ontario Environmental Protection Act is a very sophisticated and long-standing piece of legislation. Does pretty much the same thing that the CEAA did in the federal sphere for Ontario. All right, so this is the last slide with respect to environmental assessments. We'll watch this and then we'll move on to endangered spaces and species. So hopefully you guys can hear this. If you don't, let me know.
So how many of you care for the environment? Okay, 20 people. The rest of you, go to hell. Okay, so I am a really big environmentalist. I take personal responsibility for every single environmental problem there is, with the exception of the population problem. That was God's fault. First, he threw down Adam and Eve. He said, I'm done with you, I'm disgusted. It was fine up till then, until he said, go fuck yourselves. You know what a catch-22 is? When the cause leads to the effect leads to the cause, you know that? I'll give you an example. India's population density is so high, people are literally on top of each other. There are different levels of water pollution. In the United States, the first level is this river is not drinkable. The second level is this river is not swimmable. In India, the rivers are so polluted, people have stopped committing suicide off of the bridge. They're like, man, I want to go, but not like this. So you guys like wildlife documentaries? No? Yes? No? Yeah? I find them confusing. There's like a cute little lizard running along, and there's like this hawk comes and pounces on the lizard, takes it up to its nest, and then they show the hawk babies, and the babies are all... And I'm like, oh, that's so cute. And they show the lizards, like blood pouring from the lizard's face, and I'm like, the poor lizard. And they show the hawk babies, and the babies are all... And I'm like, I'm so confused. Can you give me some time to switch loyalties here? So I don't get Coca-Cola. They serve Coca-Cola in glass bottles or plastic bottles. How long does it take plastic to biodegrade? It's actually 500 years. How long does it take you to drink that Coca-Cola? It's 5 minutes. It doesn't make sense, does it? It's kind of like marriage, isn't it? For those 5 minutes of pleasure, you're stuck with a product for the rest of your life that's toxic and it can kill you. You know what I can't stand? I can't stand when people are walking on the street, they eat something, throw the wrapper on the road. I can't stand that. Unlike people, we got a system here. You're going to hold on to your trash until you see a trash can, you put it in there, and then we put it into the ocean. Do you guys believe in reuse? Yeah? Reuse is a good thing? So I'll give you, yeah, good. My shoes, for instance, these are reused, they're made from tires. Yeah? This skirt is reused, and this watch, it's stolen. So I had a pet growing up. Anyone want to take a guess as to what kind of pet I had growing up? Cat? No. Yeah, actually that's true. I had a python growing up, and I called him Balasubramanian. There's a reason for that. It was because he was dark. That's not why. It was because he had a forked tongue. No, that's not why. If it was on the basis of a forked tongue, I would have called it a Kap Panchayat. So that's good for an environmental warm-up. Here's the thing. In the history of mankind, we have been burning. We have been burning carbon fuels. We burn to produce, and then after we use it, we burn what's left. We burn the waste. Everything we do, we constantly burn, right? Fossil fuels. And that is a problem. There were 2 animal apocalyptic events. One was in Turkey, where approximately 450 sheep inexplicably jumped off a cliff. All 450 died. There was another in Africa when about 10,000 wildebeest at a river crossing all drowned. And scientists tried to find why that occurred. And they found that one leader sheep made a mistake and went off the cliff, and everyone followed. And with the wildebeest, they were trying to find a river crossing, and there was one wildebeest that made a mistake and went into the river where they could not climb off the opposite river bank. And mankind's story can also be summarized in that manner. We started off with the Industrial Revolution, and we started burning fossil fuel. The first car was a complete disaster. We said, never mind, we're going to still work on it. No research on safety issues, no research on ramifications, and then even when we found out the carcinogenic biological mutagens or neurotoxic effects of the chemicals we're using, we did not stop, because by then it was a matter of people's livelihoods. It was a matter of their money. Kind of reminds me of Bob Hope when he was asked the classic question, your money or your life? And he said, I'm thinking about it. And Al Gore, you saw Al Gore ask the question, can we change? Yes, we can change. In my life, I have devoted much of my life to do what I can to do good for the environment. I ran an environmental nonprofit in the United States and created a process where environmental results were not the end result of the process. The end result was fiscal sustainability. For instance, if I get 10 people in front of me and I ask them, do you want to protect the environment, maybe 6 of them will say yes. If I told them it's going to cost you money, then maybe 1 or 2 are going to say yes. But I gathered these 10 businessmen in the United States, and I said, would you like to save money? And I had, consequently, where environmental programs in the United States has a success rate of implementation and adoption of about 10 to 12%, I had a 95% success rate in implementation of a minimum of 60 environmental measures across solid waste minimization, energy conservation, water conservation, and pollution prevention. The restaurants that participated in this program saved $1.5 million by protecting the environment. We diverted enough solid waste from landfills to recycling and composting, as was equivalent to about 79 737 jet Boeing aircraft loaded to the maximum capacity of 79 tons each. The energy we conserved was sufficient to run the average American home for 103 years. The water we saved was sufficient to fill 45 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of water. All this can happen. When I was working in Gurgaon and living in East Delhi, I used to commute by bicycle to work once a week, 65-kilometer bike round trip, where the car I use, where the manufacturer says the maximum efficiency you can get is 23 kilometers per liter, I get 24.1 in Delhi based on how I drive. You can do a million things, including your food choices, eating lower down in the food chain. Today in Greenland, between the years 2002 2006, the Greenland lost ice equivalent to 154 to 250 cubic kilometers of ice per year. Okay? What's it going to take for us to change? And I'm not asking for change that is incremental, conservative, or small. I am asking for massive change, because that's all that's going to bring us back to a sustainable level of living. Protecting the environment is not about the environment. It's not about the tiger. It's not about the dolphin, and I have swum with dolphins in the ocean. It's about saving our own lives, right? And our future generations, and our parents. Thank you for listening, and have a great rest of the evening.
All right, guys, I'm back, hopefully. Okay, we're going to move next into the endangered spaces and species. I want to tell you just something quickly, and some of you may find this interesting. I hope you do. After I finished my practice of law, and before I decided to create a career in the academy, I was the CEO of a company called Aquaterra Energy Corporation. We actually constructed wind turbines. And these are pretty early days of this. But one of the proposals we had, and something that I left behind the table when I left the corporation, was when one of the complaints again that we saw in these videos was the incredible great amount of land mass that's required for wind turbine farms and solar farms and what have you. So our proposal was that we should micromanage that kind of provision of renewable energy, in that each home should be self-sustainable based on, and as you see it now, a lot of homes do, solar panels on the roofs, but also the installation of what are called vertical axle wind turbines, VAWTs. And if none of you have heard about those, it's because they're not well known, because they aren't as profitable as large wind turbine farms. But what they are is they are wind turbines that, instead of having blades that go around like this, they have blades that that circulate around a mast. And so our proposal was, and this is a proposal that was under study at the University of Guelph, was that if we had an appropriate battery source, and that was the killer for our proposal, is that batteries weren't sophisticated enough to do this. If each home had its own source of renewable energy, basically micromanaged down to the individual home's level, then you wouldn't need these large wind turbine farms or solar farms. That we could generate enough energy on an individual single parcel of land where a house is built, and basically feed themselves off the grid as compared to the larger projects. So in case anybody has any questions about that, I'd be glad to answer them. But that's my direct contact with renewable energy in that particular proposal. Michelle, you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a question. What about Nikola Tesla? I heard that he had an idea for electricity for everybody, and nobody would have to pay for it. No?
Well, I mean, Elon Musk and Tesla. I mean, these are guys that are incredibly creative. I know that Musk's idea was, again, I mentioned this earlier about a battery. That there was a battery. It costs about $7,000, and it's about the size of a closet door. It goes on your wall, and it will basically provide all of your energy needs for a very long period of time, internally, and therefore you wouldn't require the grid. I don't know about Tesla, but yeah, there's this kind of stuff is possible, right? And it's just a function of will. Yeah, Mike. I see it. Mike's got a comment there about Nikola Tesla, the inventor. Yeah, I get that. Any other questions about what I had to say? Good. All right. So there you go. That's my personal reflection. But so let's go to endangered species and species. All right. So obviously it's exactly what it sounds like. So we're going to talk about, in fact, these very specific. Oh, where'd that come from? Hang on. There we go. All right. All right, so again, as an overview, environmental law for the most part is designed to safeguard humans. And why wouldn't it be? That's what we care about for the most part, ourselves, our family, our children, our grandchildren, those kind of things. And so we obviously, have a primary concern with the contamination and impacts that affect us personally. However, there are, clearly, and you guys are all aware of them, there are initiatives designed to protect non-human inhabitants and the environments, right? And that's what this particular lecture is all about, right? So basically protecting endangered spaces, right? Spaces being land masses, right? So we have conservation projects in place, watershed protections in place, things that protect parks and wildlife management sanctuaries, forests, ecological reserves, recreational land reserves, and what have you, and we're protecting them for any deterioration, basically. The total protected area in Canada, according to Environment Canada, is just under 1 million square kilometers, which is 10% of the entire land base of Canada. That's a monumental chunk of this country that is environmentally protected, and it's protected by way of legislation. All right. But having said that, while that sounds like an incredibly large area of land, you've got to remember that, the vast majority of this country is unpopulated, right? So these environmental protection areas don't necessarily run along the 49th parallel, which is where the 90% of the population of Canada happens to live, right? National Parks of Canada are dedicated to the people of Canada for their benefit, education, and enjoyment, and shall be maintained and made use of so as to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. That comes from the preamble to the National Parks Act, which is a Canadian statute, basically. There is also provincial protection for endangered species. So we have, and obviously they're tailored towards the particularities of the provinces. So for Nova Scotia, for instance, all of you know Nova Scotia, it's a maritime province. It's on the Atlantic Ocean, right? So, and their beaches are incredible, just like Prince Edward Island has the same kind of thing. So there's a Beaches Act in Nova Scotia where the beaches of Nova Scotia are dedicated for the benefit, education, and enjoyment of present and future generations of Nova Scotians and protected as such. Again, the same kind of language in the Canada Parks Act. in that the purpose of protecting these lands, these park lands or beaches or whatever it's going to be, is for future generations, right? That's what they're doing. They're trying to, they're basically trying to make sure that they're there in a relatively pristine fashion for time immemorial, right? The important part of protecting beaches is that the dune systems are significant and sensitive environments that regulate, these resources. So the dunes and how they form and what have you are incredibly important for the structure of these beaches. Parks Canada has undertaken significant steps to maintain and restore ecological integrity within the park system, and there's a lot of federal parks. As a matter of fact, before COVID-19 hit, one of the things that Trudeau was proposing was that this summer, admission to all federal parks would be free, right? So he was trying to, basically raise the level of engagement and the awareness of the importance of our park system in Canada. State of the Park report provides information over 5-year cycles. Again, this is a federal initiative that support the evaluation of management actions dealing with the preservations of parks, right? The concept of public trust has been invoked in litigation for those who seek to basically impose an obligation on governments to safeguard environmental conditions and integrities of parklands. So if you were living in a particular part of the country and you thought that there were lands that were under federal jurisdiction that weren't properly being protected, right, for whatever reason, and if you're an environmentalist, you'd know what those reasons were, then often lawsuits are initiated to basically press governments of the day into safeguarding those lands. The argument about public trust is that environmental protection legislation is there for the benefit of the public, right? So that's why it's a trust for the public, and therefore the government becomes a trustee with a legally enforceable duty to protect parklands. So if the government is the trustee, then the public are the beneficiaries. All right, which is not unlike a fiduciary duty. We've talked about this a number of times. Tyler, I'd call you all the time for this. What's a fiduciary duty?
Sorry, fiduciary duty is a duty that a company must adhere to its employees, a certain level of care or standard of care that they must adhere to.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, it's not just the company, but it's anybody, any entity who has a fiduciary duty to another entity has a responsibility to care for them and to a great degree put their interests ahead of their own when it comes to that level of care, right? So, that's probably the last time I'll call on Tyler for that because we've done it 3 or 4 times, but there you go. Some legislation expressly references a statutory public trust. So an example of that is the Yukon Environment Act, right? The Yukon being a territory in northern Canada. So it designates the government of the Yukon as, and this is a quote from the legislation, the trustee of the public trust for the collective interest of the people of the Yukon. So there again is the reference to people going forward for the quality of the natural environment and the protection of the natural environment for the benefit, again, of present and future generations. All right. Beyond protection of endangered spaces on the land, we have protection for marine areas and wetlands, which are incredibly important. Federally, the Oceans Act confers on the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans the responsibility to protect marine areas, right? It's designed towards fisheries and resources or habitats in which fisheries take place. We also have wetlands, which have been profoundly affected by land use practices and policies relative to drainage and urban expansion. So this particular protection, and this is in your textbook. So wetlands, are much like marshes, and marshes are an incredibly important ecosystem, not only for the life, the species that actually live and rely upon the wetlands to survive, but for the integrity of the soil and the community around it, because wetlands, are again a biodiverse environment. In this case, this is one of the cases, that where it does in fact impact urban areas, because what very often happens is that we're in cities and towns expand out from their boundaries. They not only go out into usually farmlands, agricultural lands to build subdivisions and what have you, but they encroach upon wetlands that hadn't been developed previously. And when wetlands disappear, that whole ecosystem and all of the things that relied upon that ecosystem to survive are lost. 20,000 hectares of Canadian wetlands have been converted to agricultural use, thereby destroying biodiversity. And so, again, not only are the wetlands destroyed as a function of the expansion of urban areas, but the expansion of agriculture. This is not unlike what's happening in Brazil and the destruction of the rainforest for agriculture. The same kind of thing. The rainforest is very much an ecosystem where, thousands of species rely upon the rainforest for their existence, together with, of course, humanity does, because I believe the rainforest in Brazil, basically provides, somewhere around 60% of all the oxygen we breathe as a function of, the system, the biodiversity of the system. And when agriculture destroys the rainforest, it removes that oxygen generating abilities, and the habitat, they're gone forever, right? With respect to species, right, we're talking about plant and animal species. They're vulnerable to human activity, and the more development of human activity that takes place, the more adverse potential consequences there are, either direct or unintended. So obviously, in addition to threats such as hunting and capture of species for consumption and commerce, there's been a demolition of habitat for agricultural and urban expansion, just like we talked about a few seconds ago. The loss of individual species diminishes planetary biodiversity. The importance has been described by the federal government as follows. So here's a quote. Biological diversity is among the great treasures of our planet. It has ecological, social, economic, cultural, and intrinsic value. Biological diversity makes many essential contributions to human life, including foods, clothing, and medicines, and is an important part of sustainable social and economic development. Okay, here's a video that I put up here that's just kind of fun for you to see, but it's interesting at the same time.
God giveth, and man taketh away. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be counting down our picks for the top 10 animals that are now extinct because of humans.
Species are actually going extinct faster now as a result of us, as a result of human action on the globe than at any other time in history.
For this list, we're looking at animals that are now extinct primarily by human cause. This means that the animals have had to be officially declared extinct, and that their extinction has to be a result of human intervention.
Striped biologist taunt us! What are you gonna do? Shoot us?
Number 10, quagga.
This animal's not a zebra. The quagga.
The quagga was a uniquely patterned subspecies of zebra, with the front half looking like a zebra and the back half looking more like a horse. The quagga was a prized attraction for natives on the African plains, who hunted the quagga for its skin and sometimes for meat. When Dutch settlers colonized the area, the quagga was considered more than a pest than a prize, and it was hunted to reduce grazing competition with their own livestock. The quagga, once roaming in herds of hundreds, was decimated by the 1850s, and by 1878, the last wild quagga died. The last captive specimen died in the Natura Artis Magistra Zoo in Amsterdam in 1883.
I don't care if you found one quagga, two quagga. I care that you found any. They're extinct.
Number 9, Javan tiger. 3 tiger subspecies became extinct within the last 80 years, and the Javan tiger is among them. Formerly found in Java, the most populated island in Indonesia, the tiger was widespread on the island at the turn of the 20th century until a human population explosion resulted in a loss of habitat that caused a massive decline. In the 1930s, almost a quarter of Java was forest, but by the mid-70s, forests accounted for less than 10% of the island. Mass killings by hunters and soldiers further whittled the population down, and by 1980, only a handful of tigers remained. The last known Javan tiger was killed in 1984.
You will succeed, because you are as wily as the Javan tiger from where you get your name.
Number 8, Falkland Islands wolf. Without any predators to instill cautiousness, these small fox-like wolves were sitting ducks for the first human settlers on the island, the only land mammal native to the Falkland Islands. The wolves had no natural fear of humans and nowhere to hide if they did. With little resistance, the wolves were hunted indiscriminately for everything from fur, livestock safety, and just plain fun. By the time Charles Darwin arrived on the island in 1833, he noted the rarity of the wolves and predicted their demise within a few years. Sure enough, in 1876, the Falkland Islands wolf was extinct.
Fucking rocks and little rifles. Why? Because I want you to.
Number 7. Steller's sea cow.
Sea cow? It's a rumor around Faye's beauty shop. Some kind of a hobgoblin.
As the largest kind of Sirenia in history, the Steller's sea cow was a conspicuous staple of North Pacific marine life. Discovered by zoologist George Wilhelm Steller in 1741, the sea cow was not known for its speed. So, as a result, its slowness meant it was easily hunted by European sailors for its meat, skin, fat, and oil. The sea cow had already been hunted centuries prior by Aboriginals, meaning that only a single small population remained around the Commander Islands. By 1768, the population was entirely destroyed, and no verified sightings of the sea cow appeared after. Thus, within 27 years of Europeans first laying eyes on it, the Steller sea cow was officially extinct.
Listen, you're a sweet kid, and you deserve better than an old sea cow like me.
Number 6. Atlas bear. Used in gladiator events in Roman times, the Atlas bear was a large, formidable carnivore and the only bear endemic to modern Africa. The Roman Empire was largely responsible for the bear's decline, as thousands were captured and ritualistically killed in baiting and fighting competitions. Following the fall of the empire and the advent of firearms, the bears were overhunted and driven to small, fragmented populations in the Atlas Mountains. They became a rare and sought-after item for collectors, with many being captured for zoos and fairs, which further atrophied the population. The bears fell to human greed, and the last individual was killed in 1870.
I see. Killing that bear won't make you a man.
Oh, now you're trying to be wise.
Number 5. Great auk.
We've called the weekend Acknowledge, when it really is. We want to acknowledge the importance and significance of the great auk.
The great auk was a medium-sized flightless bird, kind of resembling a penguin. It occupied the entire expanse of the northern Atlantic Ocean, living in the coastal waters from the northeastern United States to northern Spain. Being a plump, sedentary animal, which bred on commonly navigated islands, the great auk was a practical and plentiful food source for Native American cultures and North Atlantic travelers. However, the consumption of the auks, as well as the hunting of the birds for its own down feathers, outnumbered its reproduction rates, and soon there was an existential emergency. Naturalists tried but failed to save the species, and the last confirmed specimens were shot in 1844. It was declared extinct in 1852.
What are you doing here?
I figured you'd be free. This fake job of yours can't keep you too busy now, can it?
Actually, I am busy. I'm preparing a lecture on the great auk. Thanks for dropping by.
Number 4. Thylacine.
This was the really most beautiful, spectacular flesh-eating mammal in Australia, and the first thing we did when we got here was exterminate it.
Also known as the Tasmanian tiger or Tasmanian wolf, the thylacine is a now mythic creature that was once very much real. As a large carnivorous marsupial, the thylacine was Australia's top predator for thousands of years before becoming extinct on the mainland, possibly due to competition with humans and dingoes. The tiger thrived on Tasmania, however, until Europeans settled the island and declared the rather harmless marsupial a pest. Bounty programs were set in place that destroyed thousands of thylacines, and by 1930 they were extinct in the wild, though there have been thousands of unconfirmed reports in years since, including several convincing videos. The last known thylacine died in the Hobart Zoo in 1936.
Look! Inside its pouch! Extinct Tasmanian tigers!
Number 3. Caribbean monk seal.
Monk seals. Centuries ago, they were common throughout the Mediterranean, including the Ligali Islands.
Named for the folds on its head that resembled a monk's hood, the Caribbean monk seal was extremely common in the West Indies during the 17th century. The seal's blubber offered a sizable oil yield for use in lamps and machinery, so explorers and settlers killed the docile pinnipeds by the hundreds. Commercial fishing further ravaged the population by destroying their food supply, and by the early 1900s, sightings were very rare. The last confirmed killing of a Caribbean monk seal was in 1939, and the last verified sighting was in 1952. Number 2. Western black rhinoceros.
Because the world's largest conservation network says the western black rhino is now extinct in the wild.
Traditional Chinese medicine has not been kind to rhinos of any species, and the western black rhinoceros is the latest casualty.
Illegal trade in wildlife is now estimated to be worth around $10 billion per year. This is driving many species to extinction.
Hunted for the supposed medicinal value of its horn, the western subspecies of black rhino was poached to oblivion during the 20th century.
You know, it's no accident that this species that's gone extinct is a species which is prized for one part of it, that is the horn.
Though preservation actions were taken in the 1930s, the rhino population went into a steep decline shortly thereafter, dropping to only a few hundred in the 1980s, only 10 individuals in 2000, and only 5 the next year. The last reported sighting occurred in 2006, and in 2011, the rhino was declared extinct, making it the first rhino species to go extinct in modern times, though it's likely that the Sumatran and Javan rhinos are soon to follow.
But there's a very large and extensive black market, and unfortunately, organized crime gets involved in this because it's a very valuable commodity.
Before we unveil our most unfortunate pick, here are a few honorable mentions.
She died in the Cincinnati Zoo at 1 p.m. on the 1st of September, 1914. She was literally alone for about 4 years before she died.
Number 1, dodo.
Taekwondodos! Attack!
There's no early modern extinct animal more recognizable than the dodo. A fat, large-beaked flightless bird that inhabited the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, the dodo lived in blissful harmony until Dutch settlers arrived on the island and fleeced the dodo out of its existence. Having no natural predators on an island where they reigned supreme, the dodo was completely unequipped to deal with the humans and the animals introduced by them, like pigs and macaques, that infested the island. It took only 64 years for dodos to be completely wiped out, with the birds considered officially extinct by 1662. They do, however, still live on in media as nature's punching bags.
Pull away, me hearties! Have you in port no time at all now?
Do you agree with our list? Which animal extinction peaked?
All right, guys. Okay, so back to it. So in 1975, we had and this is again, an international instrument as a function of the United Nations. We talked about that a few classes ago. So we have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Again, it's a convention, very much like a treaty, so it does have a binding effect as opposed to declarations that don't. Right, so we have this this particular convention, which basically protects wild flora and fauna, and it's called CITES. Right, that's just an acronym for it, and it's been a prominent international legal initiative to protect species throughout the world. So it's important to know. Again, remember, this is only 45 years ago. So much like the beginning of the environmental assessment movement in Canada in 1973, all of these things are relatively recent. Certainly within my lifetime easily, right? So CITES protects wildlife by regulating international trade in designated species, right? Now it's only, of course, keeping that in mind, it's only as effective as those who are prepared to follow its mandate. There are 3 categories of species that are set out in the convention. First, CITES prohibits trade in species that are threatened with extinction, right? And obviously they keep a list of these things. Second, export permits are required for species that are not yet threatened that might face extinction in the absence of effective regulation, right? And lastly, third are species identified by CITES as members of protected under their own domestic regimes, domestic being within a country's boundaries, which obviously the concept of sovereignty applies to international conventions, all right? Here's another video on African elephants and their poaching.
Elephants are one of the most iconic creatures on this planet. They're the largest land animals, the only surviving members of their order, and they are highly intelligent social beings.
They're a lot like human babies, actually. These elephants in Thailand can even paint.
It is the matriarch who guides the herds. It's the older female's vast life experience that gives them these skills.
African elephants have been here for more than 1.5 million years, and now human intervention is literally changing the face of this incredible creature. During the 1500s, an estimated 26 million elephants roamed the African continent. Today, it's less than 500,000.
They're a keystone species.
which means that without them, the environment looked completely different. For example, digging up water in the dry riverbeds, that enables other animals to come in and drink from those same water sources. They walk through the bush, they knock trees down, they're ripping up bark. They play such an important role in the ecosystem.
In the 1970s and 80s, elephant poaching reached crisis levels. So in 1989, an international agreement banned the global ivory trade. But in the past several years, poaching has returned to high levels. This chart shows the percentage of African elephant deaths caused by poaching since 2003. Their ivory tusks are basically just large teeth, but for centuries they've been used in artworks, ornaments, jewelry, even piano keys. Ivory's value has been compared to diamonds. It's a status symbol, and the rise of China's middle class has pushed up the demand for ivory there, where it sells for around $1,100 per kilogram.
To get a tusk to come out, you have to kill the elephant, it has to be hacked out. It's a horrible process.
1/3 of an elephant's tusks are in its skull, which contains a pulpy cavity of tissues, blood vessels, and nerves. That means they can't be preemptively removed by conservationists, an approach that has been applied to rhino horns, which aren't ivory, but are also sought after in Asia. Conservationists can safely remove up to 93% of a rhino's horn, but it's not possible to remove that much from elephants. But in recent decades, there's been an increasing trend of elephants being born tuskless.
Tusklessness is a natural trait in elephants, particularly in females, much less so in males.
While most African elephants of both sexes have tusks, around 2 to 6% are naturally born tuskless. Now, decades of heavy poaching have made that trait more common. This chart shows the elephant populations subject to poaching have higher rates of tusklessness compared to undisturbed populations. Let's use Gorongosa National Park as an example. Heavy poaching happened during the Civil War from 1977 to 1992. Of the older female elephants who survived the war, over half were tuskless. And of the younger females born after the war, 33% were tuskless. Because tuskless elephants were less likely to be killed by poachers, the tuskless trait became more common in the next generation. Scientists have also found that on average, tusks are smaller than they were a century ago.
Males for age have tusks that are 7 times the weight of a female of the same age. So poachers tend to focus on males first, and then they focus on older females because tusks continue to grow throughout an elephant's life. So older elephants have larger tusks.
Like tusklessness, smaller tusks provide a survival advantage against poaching, but it comes at a cost.
Can they survive without tusks? Yes, they can, absolutely. Is it a good thing to live without tusks? No, and there's a reason why elephants have evolved to have tusks. They use them extensively for foraging, self-defense, to protect their youngsters when they're vulnerable from predators like lions. The males use it in battle. To have a good set of tusks is very important.
Tusklessness is not likely to save the species from poaching and habitat loss. Yet there is some hope. Through determined conservation efforts, some African national parks are seeing growth in their elephant populations. And China has announced that by the end of 2017, they will end domestic sales and processing of ivory. Those steps, along with stronger incentives to protect elephant habitats and support local anti-poaching programs, might give elephants the leg or tusk up they need to secure their future on this planet. A big thanks to African Parks and the experts I got to interview for this video. If you want to learn more about their work in elephant conservation.
Okay, so the protection of endangered species requires legislation. All right, so this is in addition to the international convention we just talked about. Obviously, again, international conventions are something that individual countries adopt for the purposes of domestic enforcement. And in order for a convention to be enforced domestically, it requires legislation, internal domestic legislation. So in Canada, obviously, that's from the federal government. Right, so legislation would provide a mechanism for identifying and designated endangered species according to the degree of vulnerability, and these kind of things are widely known, right? Direct harm to a designated species should be prohibited, and the habitat required for the survival should be protected. These things are very much common sense. Legislation to be effective requires provision of incentives, penalties, and enforcement mechanisms against those who cause harm, right? So we now have an initiative in Canada. It's called the Species at Risk Initiative as a function of the Species at Risk Act. Again, that's a federal piece of legislation to promote the protection and recovery of endangered species. Right? The purposes of SARA are threefold. So firstly, it prevents Canadian wildlife species from becoming extinct or extirpated, which means on the way to extinction. Second, to provide for the recovery of species that are extirpated, endangered, or threatened. And thirdly, to provide for the management of species of special concern so as to prevent them from becoming endangered or threatened. So SARA, is not unique to Canada. Most countries have a very comparable piece of legislation with the same three kinds of categories. The categories are as follows. A species is extirpated if it no longer exists in the wild in Canada, but exists elsewhere in the wild, right? So not in Canada, but elsewhere. A species is threatened if it's likely to become endangered if nothing is done to reverse the factors leading to its extirpation or extinction. And a species is of special concern if it may become a threatened or endangered species because of the combination of biological characteristics and identified threats. So those are three very distinct categories to rely upon. Only species listed in this way are eligible for protective measures under SARA. Right. So in fact, in the way that a species would be, would fall within one of those categories would be as a function of regulations under this legislation. We talked a lot about what regulations do. They're a very effective nuts and bolts way to ensure that laws are put into effect, right? Regulations are passed by departments on the direction of cabinets, right? They're not legislation that require bills to be passed in the House of Commons and the Senate, for example. So that's the way species get onto the list for protection by SARA by way of regulations. By way of protective measures, Section 32 of SARA protects killing, harming, harassing, capturing, or taking an individual of a wildlife species that is listed in an extirpated species, an endangered species, or threatened species, those three categories we just talked about. Section 33 prohibits the destruction of the habitat of species at risk, right? And the limitations on this legislative protection is that it relates only to federal lands. So again, it's the same thing we've been talking about throughout the course. You have distinctions between federal jurisdiction and provincial and territorial jurisdictions. So SARA, being a federal statute, only applies to the applicability of federal law on federal lands. Right? The general provisions against harming listed species and their habitats do not apply to those species on provincial lands, and that just makes sense as a function of that. Legislation is in place with restrictions on game keeping and hunting and the manner in which animals may be trapped for fur or other commercial purposes. Right? So game keeping and hunting is important with respect to protecting species. Right? What's really important, and this has been a controversy in Canada for at least 3 decades, maybe longer, is the hunting and killing of seals in the Arctic. So this is a very short video in that regard. Turn away if you don't want to see some bloodshed.
Seals that are killed today are adults.
They're grown-up seals. They volunteer for it.
More or less.
Five seals really close together, and they're killing them one by one.
Okay, just to be clear about this, and I wanted to show it to you because the seal hunt is an annual event that's garnered a lot of protest over the years. Right before I get to you, it's important to realize that harp seals are not protected under SARA. Doesn't fall into any of the 3 categories of species for protect purposes. And in fact, the harp seal and licensing granted for that by the federal government, because it's mostly in the Arctic, which again is federal responsibility, is granted because culling the herd is seen to be a legitimate way to protect the species. Arette, you had your hand up? Arette, yes, no? Okay. With respect to domestic animals, obviously you know what that is. Legislation prohibits people from causing distress to an animal under his or her possession or ownership. This is obviously something that takes place, for the most part within urban areas or areas that are populated, because that's where domestic pets are kept. But it also includes confinement of animals in zoos and aquariums. And so the very last video I'm going to have you watch, it relates to cruelty in a place called the GW Exotic Animal Park. And so most of you probably will recognize this place. We're going to watch this video, and then I'll tell you about it afterwards, and ask for those of you who in fact do know about this particular park, and it's a very, very common reason why you should know this. All right, so let's watch this, and then we'll talk about it.
So is the vet gonna come euthanize him, or are we just gonna shoot him?
No, we've got to fucking shoot him.
We're just gonna blow his head off?
Fuck, put a hole in his head, yeah.
Why can't we just have the vet come do it?
One, it's gonna be a lot cheaper than fucking buying medication to fucking euthanize him.
Really?
And 2, it'll just be a waste of time and money.
But it's just, he's just laying here suffering. There's nothing we could do for him?
No. And it sucks.
That fucking sucks.
It sucks.
So until tomorrow night,
he's gonna have to lay here and suffer, yes.
Just
same with that other horse. That other horse is gonna have to suffer until tomorrow night.
Suffering. He's obviously in pain. Look at his leg. Could we get some pain medication from the vet and shoot him up,
and
load
then
him?
we can't feed him to the cats.
If they have any medication in him, you can't, because then the cat will fucking get the medication and fucking kick over.
Really?
One of the iffy ends and
His face is falling apart. Sucks. You know how much pain he's got to be in?
Yeah. I do. But
look at he's got.
Believe me, if I could, I'd put a bullet in his head, end it now, and butcher him and feed him out right now. But I can't.
Just because the USDA might show up today?
Yes.
Blood drops on the floor. Come here, girl. Come here. Oh, man, girl, look up. What, baby? I know, yeah, I do. You bite him, it's okay.
Sure it hurts, there's no doubt in my mind.
Come on. No.
That white type fucking dick. Either that or I'll go in there and beat the fuck out fucking idiots. Get out of it!
But they can't go back unless they've got video cameras out here to prove that we didn't feed them that day. There's no fucking way. There's no way that they can prove that we didn't feed them.
So then that's okay then that we put it in the feed book that we fed them even if we didn't?
Because there's no way that they can come out here and say, oh, on a Tuesday fucking last week, you didn't feed.
If say we didn't feed them for 2 days, is that like a law that we can't?
Yeah, it's in the USDA book. You can only fast 1 day a week.
Yeah. So those weeks that we fasted 3 or 4 days,
yeah, we could have got shut down because we didn't have the means to fucking provide for them. Yeah, we could have got shut down.
Look how skinny Honey is. She's a nursing mother. Hey, Honey, look at those ribs on her showing through.
I don't like the breeding ideal, but that's what keeps the park open.
That's where he gets the money from the babies.
Yeah.
So he's gonna breed this one?
He's gonna try to breed both of them, but this guy will probably be the first one to go over there.
I feel bad because the cubs are pulled from the mother like the first day and all. And
yeah.
I feel bad, you know. I feel like they're crying for their mom and shit like that.
Yeah. That's why I say it's a 50-50 place out here.
But without them, he really won't get any of the money to run the place, right?
Guy, make babies. We're waiting. Jay's waiting to book the show, so we know we got some cubs.
All right, guys. And we'll see you or talk to you next Tuesday. Thanks, guys.